Okay, today we are doing Siman Tzadi Chesef Beis. Excuse me. And what we're going to talk about is as follows. In a lot of things in Hilchos Taruvos, differentiate between whether something is min b'minoi or min b'she'eni minoi. Min b'minoi means they're similar, and min b'she'eni minoi means they're dissimilar. Something's not something about them. And in our din, halacha beis, this is a very important machlokes between the Ramah and the Shach about what does it mean min b'minoi and what does min b'she'eni minoi. And it comes out as, it seems like a very theoretical difference, but today what I'm going to talk about is a specific situation where that shaila became very much halacha l'maisa, had a very practical application. So we're going to talk about that shaila, and we'll see how it applies to this case. So let me just give two types of background. The first is that 15 years ago or so, it was figured out that there's this really large bourbon company that's owned by one Jewish person, and that person never did mechiras chametz. So if you look at first, that seemed pretty obvious then that all the bourbon that this company makes and other similar products should be automatically asher chametz of a Pesach. Why is that? Because bourbon is mainly made out of corn, but it's usually about 30% chametz, which is to say that it has rye and barley also, which are mixed with water. So it's 30% chametz. And bourbon by law is always aged for 2 years. Well, if it's aged for 2 years and it contains chametz, that means for sure this Jewish person owned it over at least one Pesach, 2 Pesachs also, and therefore, by the time it comes to the store, it's automatically chametz of a Pesach. Okay, so that's at the first glance, it seemed that it's obvious that this thing, all the product made by this company should be, all the bourbon and similar items made by this company should be also as chametz of a Pesach. And there were a lot of Rabbanim got involved in this question. Some of them came up with reasons to be maybe makel about, and maybe be makel b'diavad. Most of those were not so convincing. I'm going to mention a little bit of that as I pass in certain parts as we talk about it today. But we're going to focus on a very specific tzad l'hakol, which has to do with our din. It's from Rav Shlomo Miller, who came up with a reason to potentially be makel about these products, at least b'diavad, or in cases of where people had a big hefsid, to be makel. Okay, the hefsid was that there were people who owned many bottles of this product as investments, or because they owned a store or something like that. Excuse me. And for them, it wasn't just a matter of pouring out one $50 bottle worth of schnapps. It was a significant hefsid for these people. Okay, so now let's do one more introduction. It has to do with Hilchos Chametz, just to get our bearings over here, and that is as follows. The din is that if a yid owns chametz over Pesach, and that chametz was asher mid'oraisa, then that chametz becomes chametz over Pesach. Okay, what happens if you own a chametz that was only asher mid'orabanan? I mean, it was only asher mid'orabanan to own that chametz. Then there's no issue of chametz over Pesach. Okay, so one important example of that happens to come from our din. It's not connected to our real topic, but it comes from our din, and that is like this. We know that when Isser gets mixed into Heter, it needs to be Balta B'Shishim. As long as it's Nois and Tam, until it's Balta B'Shishim, it's Asr. But there's a difference. When it's Min B'She'eni Minoi, when it's two different foods, then Bita B'Shishim is the Raisa requirement, and therefore, but if the foods are Min B'Minoi, if they're the same kind of foods mixed together, then with the Raisa it would be Balta B'Roiv, Mid Rabbanon, it has to be Balta B'Shishim. So, for example, if we have 1 pound of Isser falls into 5 pounds of Heter, so if they're Min B'Minoi, then Mid Raisa, that Taruvos is mutter. The two things are 1 piece of meat falls into 5 pieces of meat, 1 pound of meat falls into 5 pounds of meat. Mid Raisa it would be Balta, it's Balta B'Roiv. Mid Rabbanon, we say that we need Shishim in order to be matri. Okay, so that's for regular Isser. What has to have to do with Hilchos Pesach? In Hilchos Pesach, that means is that if I have 1 pound of chametz mixed into 5 pounds of food that's not chametz, then it depends like this. If it depends whether it's min b'minoi or min b'she'eni minoi. If it's min b'minoi, then mid'oraisa that 1 pound of chametz is bottled into the 5 pounds of non chametz. And therefore, so min b'minoi would be bottled. Mid'oraisa it's bottled. Midrabanan you're not allowed to own that over Pesach because it wasn't bottled b'shishim. But if the person did own it over Pesach, then if the Pesach will be mutter, we would say that it's min. It's min b'minoi, and it's it was mid'oraisa. You were allowed to eat it, Midoraisa you were allowed to. I'm sorry, not eat it. Midoraisa, you were allowed to keep it, and therefore it's only us and Midarbanan to keep it, and therefore we're not the Chametz of Pesach. What happens if that mixture had been min b'she'enim, 1 pound of chametz in 5 pounds of not chametz, which is min b'she'enim? Then the din is midoraisa you weren't allowed to keep it, and then it would be chametz of Pesach. Okay, so those are the background for the halachas of what's chametz of Pesach and what's not chametz of Pesach. And now let's get back to us to Hilchos Taruas. So the Gemara, reads the Gemara in Avodah Zarah and Ayin Vav. I'm sorry, Samach Vav has a machlokes about this rule that we have a min b'mina, min b'she'enim. What happened? How do we decide? What's the criterion for min b'mina? How do we tell if it's the same min or it's not a min? So one of the Gemara's examples of the shaila is should we go basar shema? Should we say min b'mina depends on what the name of the foods are? If they have the same name, they're considered min b'mina. If they have a different name, they're min b'she'enim. Or should it depend on basar taima? Should it depend on whether they have the same taste or a different taste? That's how we decide whether something is min b'mina, min b'she'enim. One of the more examples is what happens if we have malt vinegar and wine vinegar. So malt vinegar and wine vinegar have the same name. They're both called vinegar. This is malt vinegar means it comes from grains, from barley, and wine vinegar comes from wine. So they have the same name. They're both vinegar, but the taste is not the same. The taste is different. They're not the same flavor. So if we go basar shema, then they're the same. They're considered min b'mina. If we go basar taima, if we go basar by the taste, they're not the same taste, and it's min b'she'enim mina. Okay, so that's a machlokes in the Gemara, and the din is we follow Rava that we go basar shema. Okay, the din is that we go basar after what the names are. Okay, but in that there's a machlokes. Now, what did Rava mean when he said we go basar shema? We go by the name. We consider the wine vinegar and malt vinegar to be the same thing, to be min b'mina. So the Ramah says it's for every case. Whenever you want to know whether something is min b'mina, like I've been telling you until now for the past couple of minutes, you want to know if something min b'mina or min b'she'enim. The way you know is if you excuse me, the way you know whether it's min b'mina or min b'she'enim is by is whether it has the same name or not. Okay, but the Shach says that doesn't make any sense. He says Shach says, well, how could it be that it could depend on whether it has the same name or not? How could that be logical? That it could possibly depend that we know that tam keikum is deraisa. Things depend on taste. Why should we care about whether it has the same name or not? So the Shach says the whole machlokes of the Gemara is in a completely different case. The machlokes of the Gemara is for foods that are not batal b'shishim. So when a food is not batal b'shishim, that means is we don't care about the tam. Whether it's batal or not batal is not because it tastes like this or it doesn't taste like this. Tam doesn't play a role into whether it's mutter or not, whether it's batal or not. So in that case, we pass on like Rava that you follow the shame. Does it have the same name? It does not have the same name. But if it's a thing that depends on tam, like bitul b'shishim, he says no, for sure everyone will agree that in that case you go basar taima, you go basar whether they taste the same or they don't taste the same. Okay, so a lot of achronim, most of the achronim find that's even what the Pri Megadim says. Kol achronim hiskimu find the Shach to be very convincing. What he's arguing seems to make a lot of sense. Okay, but Lamaisa is there are others, Chavastas, who say explain the Ramah and give a shot in that. So in special cases, there are those who are makel to be somewhat on the Ramah, but the Ikar din is like the Shach. It appears to be like the Shach that we go basar. For regular cases of bit of b'shishim kind of things, we follow taima. We depend on whether they taste the same or they don't taste the same. Okay, now, as I mentioned before, that bourbon, give or take, is 70% corn, meaning not chametz, and 30% chametz, rye and barley. So that means is it's a mixture of different kinds of alcohols, of rye alcohol and corn alcohol, which don't have the same taste. But they have the same title. They're both called alcohol. In fact, this case is almost exactly the same thing what the Gemara said. The Gemara said a case of malt vinegar and wine vinegar mixed together, and we're saying corn alcohol and rye alcohol mixed together. It's almost the same thing. They have the same name. They're both called alcohol. In this case, they're both called alcohol. Like in the Gemara's case, they were both called vinegar, and they have a different taste. And therefore, according to the Ramah, this counts as min b'minoi. Which means is, according to the Ramah, it would be min b'minoi. If it's min b'minoi, means it's midoraisa, it's batal b'roiv, and therefore, if a yid owned it over Pesach, it would have only been an issa d'Rabbanan to own it over Pesach, and therefore, if he kept it, it wouldn't be chametz over Pesach. That's according to the Ramah. But according to the Shach, most people hold the Shach. According to the Shach, we would consider this min b'she'ein minay because they have different tastes. The fact that they have the same name doesn't make a difference, and we would say Bitul Boruch is not enough, even midaraisa, and therefore it would be awesome. According to the Shach, it would seem to be a case of min b'she'ein minay, which midaraisa is no good. So if you want to be samech on the Ramah, so there's a tad to be samech on the Ramah. So we could be making like the Ramah b'makom hefsed, maybe especially because chametz of a Pesach is only issa d'Rabbanan, as opposed to usually we think about it's a possible issa d'Oraisa. So maybe there's a tad to be make like the Ramah. That's a possibility. You could be make on this stuff b'makom hefsed based on the Ramah. Okay, now other people were not so convinced that even this was worth to be samech on. Even if you want to be samech on the Ramah in certain cases, the others were not convinced that this was right, and they said because we're making a mistake. We're saying it has a different shame. It has the same shame. It's corn alcohol and rye alcohol, and those are the same. They're alcohol and alcohol. They say no, that's not correct because no one calls it corn alcohol and rye alcohol. They call it bourbon and rye. That's how it's referred to. If you walk into the store and you want to buy this product, you don't say, "Can I have some rye alcohol?" or "Can I have some corn alcohol?" You say, "Can I have some bourbon?" or "Can I have some rye?" That's how you call it. So they don't have the same shape. They're not called vinegar, as opposed to they're not called alcohol. As opposed to vinegars, when you want to buy mulled vinegar, it's called mulled vinegar, and it's called wine vinegar. That's what it's called. So people argue that even the Ramah would say that this is considered to have a different shame. Okay, so Rosh Miller said no, he did not buy that. He said that if you know more about making whiskey, you wouldn't have said that. And he said like this. He says there's a reason why when you buy bourbon, by law it has to be at least 51% corn, but almost never is it 100. Almost nobody makes 100% corn bourbon. There's almost no such thing, and the reason is because corn alcohol doesn't have such great taste. It has a lot of alcohol. Corn is a great source of making alcohol. But if you want the taste, you want to add rye, because rye is a good character of taste to it. And you add barley, because it also has taste, but its special role is because it provides the amylase enzyme. Okay, we'll explain that a different day, what that is. But it provides, it has an important role in making the product over here. Okay, so when you buy bourbon or rye or all these things, the bourbon is not just corn alcohol, because corn alcohol doesn't have what people want. And so he said like this. He said, when we have the alcohols by themselves, just the alcohol, corn alcohol, rye alcohol, barley alcohol, those are actually called that. They're called corn alcohol. The term bourbon or the term rye is used when we made a combination. We've created something. We say a little of this alcohol, a little of this alcohol, a little of this alcohol. We mix it together in the right proportions. Then we call that thing bourbon. Or we make rye. We mix things together and we make rye. He says, but the alcohol when we're talking about the bitul, which is when they're mixed together just in the alcohol state, when they're like that. In fact, in that case, they are called corn alcohol, rye alcohol, barley alcohol, and they do have. According to the Ramah, he said that you could still consider them to have the same shame, and you could say they're min b'minoi, that would be both the midaraisa, that midaraisa would be both the Boruch. Okay, that's one thing. But then, so all this has so far been to say is why you could be makel based on the Ramah. But Rosh Miller says, I'll tell you something. Even the Shach, I think, might be makel in this case also. Okay, now the Shach is, what do you mean? How could the Shach be makel? Most of the time, they have different tastes to them. So he said that based on the Minchas Baruch. But before to explain the Minchas Baruch, let me just give a little more detail, and that is the way you make whiskey is that you take some kind of a source of starch or sugar. So let's say in our case corn or rye and barley, and you convert them into sugar, and then you add yeast to it, and the yeast ferments this what it's called a mash. It ferments it into what they call a beer. Okay, which is to say is it makes it to the point that it's like 9, 10, 11, 12% alcohol. Okay, now that's as much high percentage of alcohol that can be created naturally. That's how much the yeast can do. Let's say it makes up to 9%, 12%, something like that, a certain amount percentage alcohol. But people don't want to drink that. Well, that would be, they call it a beer because it's along the alcohol, about the alcohol level of a beer that you drink, that a person might want to drink. But what they do is, then they distill it. And then distillation is the way of essentially boiling the alcohol out of this mixture, so the alcohol gets separated, leaving liquid, more of the water behind. So now, all of a sudden, we have this more concentrated. They will distill it up to, give or take, 60%. Usually it's stored at 62.5%. That's like a legal limit. So about 60% alcohol. You concentrate it by getting out the alcohol. And then we have this concentrated alcohol that's about 60%. Okay, now, before I go on to explain to you this tzad of this Minchas Boruch and how Rosh Hashanah is going to say, I'm going to distract for 1 second to tell another tzad. This is not Rosh Hashanah's main reason to be mekel. It's a separate thing, which is, you probably know that when you go to the store, the bourbon that you buy is not going to be 60% alcohol. It's going to be, give or take, 40%, 45% alcohol. That's a typical amount. Which is to say is that the bourbon is put away, is aged at a higher amount, at 60 or 62.5% alcohol, and then when it comes time for bottling, they water down the product to the point that it's, give or take, 40% alcohol. Now, if you think about that, you realize that, let's say we had a barrel that was 50 gallons, just for argument's sake, it was 50 gallons. If that of those 50 gallons, we said 30% of that is chametz. Okay, so that means is of the 50 gallons that are in this barrel, 15 gallons of that are chametz, and the other ones are not. I mean, before Pesach, there's no chametz, there's no chanans and things like that. So we have 15 gallons of chametz and 35 gallons of non-chametz. Okay, well, now when it comes down to water it down, to get from 62.5% to 40 or 45% takes between 19 and 28 gallons of water. Okay, you don't just add in a little water, you have to add a relatively large amount of water into that. Well, that means is the amount of water that we're adding in is more than the amount of chametz that was in here. Remember, there was 15 gallons of chametz in the barrel, and we're adding in 19 to 28 gallons worth of water. Okay, so what? Now that happens at bottling. That happens after Pesach. It's been aged for a bunch of years, over many Pesach, and now, let's say on Shavuos, they take the barrel out, they water it down and put it into the bottle. When they do, at that point, when they water it down, they've been mevatel the chametz b'roiv. Okay, what does that mean? Well, the Shulchan Aruch says that chametz shalov of Pesach, the chametz that they just watered down was chametz shalov of Pesach. Chametz shalov of Pesach is the din is that the Mechaber says it needs to be batel b'shishim. If it's batel b'roiv, it's not good enough. But the Magen Avraham says no, really it's batel b'roiv. And the Mishmur says, "But Malcolm Hefsed, Malcolm Hefsed Ruba, a person could be samech on the Oshas Chak on the Magen Avraham." So, guess that's what happened over here. We were mevatel the chametz of Pesach b'roiv. We took enough water was added in to be mevatel b'roiv, and that would make the would make it mutter at least b'Malcolm Hefsed Ruba to be samech on the Magen Avraham that bit the b'roiv is enough after Pesach, not before Pesach. It's enough to be mevatel after Pesach. Okay, so let's put that on the side. Okay, back to where we were. So what I was saying is that in order to make the bourbon, you take what they call the beer, which is at 9, 10, 11, 12% alcohol, and then you distill it to make it into a whiskey, into a liquor, something that's more concentrated. So the Minchas Boruch says like this. He says, this that we say, that different kind of alcohols, the alcohol from corn and the alcohol from barley and from rye have different tastes, that the Shach is going to consider them to be min b'she'ein minui. This that we say that's fine when it's in the beer state, at the state when it's just maybe 10, 12% alcohol. At that point, we could say they have different tastes. He says, but once we distill it, the point of distillation is to separate the alcohol from the rest of the water and whatever's left behind. He says at that point, the difference between one alcohol and the next is very minor. It's not significant enough to be considered a difference, significant enough that anyone should consider it to be min b'she'ein minui because of the taste. The taste is relatively the same between one and the next. So the whole machlekes would have been, is let's say by vinegar, where the vinegar from malt and the vinegar from wine are significantly different from each other. The tastes are very different. But over here, once we distill it, the taste is going to be, give or take, going to be similar enough anyhow. So therefore, even the shach will say that it's min b'minui because the taste is relatively similar. Okay, that's not such an unusual idea, which is taste doesn't have to be exact to be min b'minui. It could even be similar. Similar is good enough also. So that's what he says. So the Minchas Baruch says is that the whole shaila is only when we have so to speak, a beer, an alcohol at a lower concentration. But once we distill it, then it, even though Shach will agree that they're min b'minoi because they have the same taste. And Rosh Hashanah said that you could be samech on this Minchas Baruch, but people had a hefsid or hefsid meruba, and if being machmer would mean to throw out thousands of dollars worth of liquor, he said a person could be makel. Now, other people did not buy this. They said first of all, they said this idea that the Minchas Baruch is saying that after distillation the taste is relatively similar on how the Minchas Baruch says it comes from some Sefer and Noid Yehuda who say that. And if you look at those, you go look back at the Marmakomis that he's quoting, the people who asked the Shaila to the Chassam Sofer and the Yehuda both suggested this idea, but both of those poskim were not so happy about that. They weren't so convinced that was correct. So even though Minchas Baruch is accepting it, and it's in the printed book Chassam Sofer and the Yehuda, those poskim, the Chassam Sofer and the Yehuda, were not so excited about such a svara. So one is, from din-wise, we could question whether actually to be samach on the Minchas Baruch. But the second is, the people who are in the industry said, "What are you talking about? It's not true. That distilled corn alcohol and distilled rye alcohol don't taste the same. They have very different tastes. We think that they're not at all the same taste. So why would you say that when they're distilled? Excuse me. Why would you say that when they're distilled, the taste is so similar that it's considered min b'mina?" He says it's not true. They don't taste the same. They taste very different from each other. So what they said is that when the Minchas Baruch is talking about, the Minchas Baruch, it's not clear what case he's talking about. What he said is, when the Minchas Baruch meant it was not for our kind of a situation where they're making something like bourbon. He says, he was talking about where the people were making vodka. Okay, when you make vodka, you don't distill to 62%. You distill to 95% alcohol. And to the point that it has a new name. It's called grain neutral spirits in English. We call grain neutral spirits. It means these are spirits, this alcohol, that has grain neutral. I mean, the taste that it has no connection to the original grain that it had. You can't see any connection between them because we've removed everything. We distill that and just have basically pure alcohol. It's 95% pure alcohol. And not only do we separate the alcohol from the water, the taste also has become separated, and all we have in front of us is pure alcohol. He says, so that was the kind of case where the Minchas Baruch could say is that after that distillation, whether it came from corn or it came from rye or barley or whatever it is, it makes no difference. It's all the same. It all has the same time. And that was a case where the shach might be mekel. He says, but for a case like ours, where we're talking about corn alcohol or rye alcohol distilled only to 62.5%, he says, no, of course it would have a difference. It would have a difference in taste. Okay, so that was their argument to think why not to make according to this. Rosh Hashanah didn't accept that. He said he didn't agree with that. He thought that's not true. Lamai says, just because something has a little bit of a different taste, and experts might know the difference, that doesn't mean that in din that's considered to be that it has the same taste. That has a different taste, and he stuck with this. That he said b'makam hefsid. So again, the stud lahakal he's suggesting one is maybe we could be samech on the Rambal who says that you go basa shema, that you go you follow the name, and they both barley alcohol and corn alcohol are both considered to have the same name. They're both alcohol, and a second side is that even according to the shach that we go basa taima. Over here, that shaila of basar taima is not for distilled products. And once a product is distilled, he's arguing that we could then be samech and say that it has the same tam. It essentially has the same tam. And again, he's not saying that a person should be samech on this every day of the week. He's saying that b'makam hefsid or makam hefsid meruba, a person would be able to be samech on these kind of svaras.